Jim Penman is an Australian businessman with a PhD in history, and he's developed a theory of history that he calls biohistory, which is the title of the books he's written about his theory and also the name of his website. And on his website you can not only find an explanation of his theory, but also some computer software to allow people to play around with the ideas of the theory, and even an offer of a financial reward for anybody who uses his ideas to build a fully working model of historical processes. And Penman believes that history is driven by physiological processes, by hormones in our bodies that affect our behaviour. And he justifies this perspective with reference to the way things like that operate in the animal kingdom. So particularly he draws attention to the behaviour of lemmings. So of course lemmings famously are the creatures that fling themselves off cliffs in a mass stampede. But what happens with lemmings is that they have a 10-generation cycle where for most of the time they're peacefully, feeding on grass and quietly just going about their business. But their population expands, so they become overpopulated, and this is when every 10th generation they go into an exploratory mode, exploration, looking for new territory driven by this overpopulation, and this is when, famously they run over cliffs. But more generally, they're just interested in finding new territory. And it's driven by this gradual increase in population. And how do the lemmings know that it's time to explore? Well, the increase in population, putting pressure on resources, increases the stress. And so it changes hormones within their bodies that then leads to this drive, urge to go out and explore. And what Penman suggests is that the same thing happens in humans, that there is an intergenerational cycle or cycles. In things like population, but also more generally in social vigour, so that the lemmings go from sort of peaceful and quiet and just chomping the grass to suddenly getting into their heads to start going out vigorously, expanding and exploring. Similarly, humans sometimes live quietly and peacefully and things don't change very much, but other times they're very expansive and innovative and creative. So there are these intergenerational cycles, the same as the 10-generational cycle of lemmings, in social vigour. So we're talking about things like not just exploration, but innovation, conflict, and economic growth, and things like, artistic endeavour and scientific discovery and so forth. Well, clearly these intergenerational cycles to some extent resemble the structural demographic cycles of Peter Turchin. which we'll be studying in detail in a later module when we come on to look at cyclical theories of history, but we've touched on them a bit in previous modules. The idea that population expands, which leads to pressure on resources, people are poorer, and this leads to conflict and a crisis which causes a population crash, and so there's now not nearly so much pressure on resources and the cycle can start again. Well, this is a similar sort of thing that we see in the lemmings, and that Penman is arguing for also in humans. So the sort of observable matches. It's driven by population expansion, and it results in things like conflict and whether there's economic growth or economic collapse. But for Penman, it's driven by these hormonal changes in people, whereas for Turchin, it's driven by sociological changes. Another thing that Penman draws attention to from the animal kingdom is the difference in the behaviour of gibbons versus baboons. So with gibbons, they live in small nuclear families. They're hard-working, we could say. In that they spend a lot of time gathering food, going about their business, and they invest in their few offspring. So they only have a small family, and they spend a lot of time on nurturing and caring for their offspring. And we can contrast this with baboons, who live in extended families, so there will be typically a dominant male and a number of subordinate males and juvenile males and multiple females who are part of the dominant male's harem. So that's a very hierarchical society among the males, and the dominant male has a disproportionate share of the resources of the pack, the troop, say. And they have many offspring. So the dominant male can produce many offspring with his many female hangers-on. And baboons are aggressive, not like gibbons, which are just quiet and peaceful and mostly concentrating on gathering food. They're aggressive, they're nomadic, so they roam around the plains, and they're opportunistic. So instead of just investing in small nuclear families, that's supposed to say nuclear. Instead of just investing in small nuclear families, if they find themselves in conditions of abundance, then they'll produce masses of offspring. So to population ecologists, they would call this a K-type strategy, and this an R-type strategy. We've mentioned that in the mathematical module. And So what Penman says is that we see these same types of behaviour in humans. Humans are actually capable of both. We're, like them, we're primates, like gibbons and baboons. And this kind of behaviour is what we would consider civilised behaviour. And the other kind of behaviour of baboons is what we might call uncivilized or barbarian behaviour, which is all about exploration and, in human terms, building empires. So it's aggressive, it's nomadic, so it's moving out, it's aggressive, it's trying to take control of other groups and build these dominant hierarchies. And so for Penman, humans are kind of more flexible. Gibbons are just one type and baboons are the other. But humans can exhibit either type of behaviour depending on changes in their hormones. And these changes in hormones are influenced by their environment and also can be passed down from generation to generation. So let's have a look at what Penman identifies as his key physiological variables. Okay, so these are Penman's 5 physiological variables that drive behaviour and therefore drive historical change as behaviour changes. So his first concept is that which he gives the symbol C, standing for civilization, and the type of physiological variable is epigenetic. Now he distinguishes between epigenetic, hormonal and genetic variables. So let's just go through those. Genetic is changes due to natural selection, changes in our genes. So people with different genes have different behaviours. So if natural selection operates on a population to select a particular gene producing a particular type of behaviour, then the overall behaviour of the population will change as that gene becomes more common. So this is a genetic type of variable. That's how that works. A hormonal variable is something that only affects the individual and is hormones released in our body by environmental influences. And then epigenetic is between the two. It's something that affects an individual in their lifetime and is caused by environmental influences. But even when the environmental influence is removed, there may have been permanent changes in the individual's genome so that they will persist in that behaviour. And what is more, they will be able to pass that behaviour down to their own offspring. Epigenetic changes, this is something that's been discovered in the last few decades. Epigenetic changes can be passed down from parent to child. So civilization is an epigenetic one. So it's caused by, as we'll shortly see what causes it, but it's caused by sort of exposure to an authoritarian environment. It makes people hardworking and exhibiting civil obedience and so on. So these are epigenetic changes caused by environmental influences, and I've listed them here. To repeat, hard work, propensity for trade rather than being self-sufficient, civil obedience, so prepared to fit in with authority and with other people, late marriage, nuclear families, and sexual restraint, so in other words small families and tolerance of high population densities, because people are kind of self-disciplined and are prepared to live closely packed together with other people without causing trouble. So this is the civilization variable, and we can see these are firstly the kind of traits that we might associate with civilized people, and they're also the gibbon style of traits. So gibbons, in Penman's view, would have a high C. And then the next variable is V for vigour, and this is the baboon kind of behaviour. So this Penman thinks is also epigenetic, like civilization, but can also be hormonal. So stresses can temporarily increase vigour. So stresses produce hormones that make a population more vigorous, but then when those stresses are taken away, the amount of vigour decreases again. But there is some lasting effect, so it's partly epigenetic, partly hormonal. And this is associated with all those baboon-like properties: competition, competitiveness, aggression, intolerance of high population. So baboons, you know, if they live too packed together, they'll soon start wandering off because they're nomadic. They don't like living closely packed. Powerful rulers and priests. So as we saw in the baboons, they have dominant males, and the other males accept this hierarchical structure. They're self-confident, so they you know, are prepared to go out exploring and be adventurous. They're patriarchal, dominant males, and they have a tolerance of hierarchy, as I've just said, same as the powerful rulers and priests. They kind of expect hierarchy. They understand that there are some dominant people and some more submissive people. Then another variable which doesn't have a symbol is just that of stress. So environmental stress, which causes a release of hormones, and the effect that that has on behaviour is it creates an increase in the level of fear and suspicion of others, which can result in steep hierarchies. So you know, very dominant people come to power. When people feel fearful, they're much more inclined to get behind strong and authoritarian hardline leaders. So steep hierarchies, which though tend to be unstable, and people are submissive. This is, I suppose, the flip side of that. They're prepared to follow strong leaders. And then the next variable is S for stability. And this is a genetic variable. So this is something that changes over long periods. And in fact, it tends to arise after a civilization has collapsed. So over the course of a civilization, there is natural selection that produces genetic change in the population to have this physiological factor inclined towards stability, which is characterized by tolerance of high density societies, so rather like that, but high tolerance of high density societies that lack creativity and lack prosperity. So whereas this kind of behavior is found in vigorous civilizations, or not vigorous perhaps I should say, but effective civilizations, this is found in stagnant civilizations. People you know, live close packed, but they accept an unchanging lifestyle and a relatively impoverished lifestyle. So this is really corresponds to Spengler's fellahin type of civilization, or the fellahin condition after a civilization has gone through its Spenglerian life cycle. So you know, Penman is kind of agreeing with Spengler and others that once a civilization has gone through its cycle, then it degenerates into an unchanging, stagnant kind of society with no more potential for creativity and innovation. But for Penman, this is due to genetic changes in the population, whereas for someone like Spengler, there's no particular explanation as to why that should occur. It occurs once a civilization has exhausted its potential. That's it. But what causes a civilization to exhaust its potential for Spengler is not defined. But here it's related to genetic changes. And then the last variable is G for growth. And Penman's not quite sure about this, but he thinks it might be an epigenetic variable factor. It's what varies in the lemming cycle. And so he defines this as adventurousness, that exploration, drive to explore. So it's not the same as vigour. I mean, you might think adventurousness is part of vigour, but here we're specifically focusing on that ability or drive to move out and explore. And we'll now just take a closer look at the C and the V variables. Okay, so here are Penman's two key physiological variables, C for civilization and V for vigour, and what causes them and what effect that has. So for C, civilization, this arises in people when they're exposed to a strict authority. So an authority that doesn't tolerate misbehaviour. So they learn habits of self-discipline. So they become hardworking and obedient and those other things that we saw. So they learn that if they step out of line, they will be punished. So they learn to control their own behaviour. And so they're also able, for example, to get on with other people because they don't cause trouble. Then V for vigour results from stress. When people are stressed, it makes them aggressive. So stress means that they're experiencing threats or problems in their lives. They then become aggressive to confront those threats or solve those problems. So they're vigorous. And then Penman suggests that it also matters where in people's lives these conditions arise. So particularly if people experience this in childhood versus adulthood. So he defines a separate thing but related called infancy, which is the kind of physiological change that occurs when people are exposed to a strict upbringing. So strict authority in childhood. And he says that in this case, they are not only industrious, which is a feature of civilization generally, hard-working, but they're also creative. So a population that's just exposed to authority will, control itself and become self-disciplined. But one that experiences a strict upbringing becomes hard-working and creative as well. And whereas this just generally produces civilized attitude, civilization, this, he argues, results in people being resistant to imperialism. They're independent. They are not easily inclined to submit to outsiders or to be incorporated into large political entities. And the same with V for vigour. He defines child V, which is produced when people are exposed to stress and sort of controlling behaviour when they're 6 to 12 years old. He says that if the stress operates in that age band, then people become not just aggressive, they are aggressive, but they're also traditionalist. So, in other words, culturally conservative, and they're aggressive and obedient, accepting these hierarchies and social conservatism, and they're prepared to live in large political units. So the opposite here, whereas these resist empire, these people are prepared to be part of, as I say, large political units. And he then suggests that if a society has both strong C and strong V, so these aren't mutually exclusive, then they're likely to be successful. Societies, in his term. So something like the Roman Empire. If you combine these self-discipline and aggression, then you get the Roman Empire. Where self-discipline on its own isn't enough, because you have to be prepared to try and go out and conquer people, and aggression on its own isn't enough, because then you're just a barbarian war band raiding but not leaving any legacy of advanced political organization. But if you've got both, then you've got a large, complex, powerful society. And Penman then argues that there is a civilizational cycle that societies go through involving a variation in the levels of C and V over time in the relevant population. So let's have a look at how that works. Okay, so this is Penman's idea of a civilizational cycle in V and C. And how it works is that V and C go around this circle. So this is really a phase plot of the motion in C and the variables C and V, rather than plotting how they change over time. It's plotting the two variables against each other, a phase plot. We saw that concept in the mathematical module. And his argument then is that when V is high, that means stress is high, because stress produces V. So when V and stress are both high, that tends to cause C to increase. So people are subject to strong authority, vigorous authority. They tend to become more self-disciplined and obedient. And so, in other words, C is increasing at this point. So it's moving in that direction, in the direction of increasing C. And then when you've got a high level of C, then people are obedient and hardworking and less troublesome. That causes stress to decrease. People get on with each other better, and so stress is less, and therefore V decreases as well. So at this point, with high C, V is decreasing. And then down here, we've now got a low level of V, implying low stress, and with low stress, that means that C now decreases. There's less pressure on people to get along because things seem to be fairly easy going, and people let their hair down and become less obedient, less hardworking. So C is decreasing. And then at this point we've got low C, and because of low C, so people have stopped being obedient, they've stopped being prepared to live at high population densities, they've stopped being hardworking, so their economic situation may deteriorate. All this produces stress, which causes V to increase again. And so here V is increasing, we're moving up. So that's why we keep going around this cycle, according to Penman. We could put this in mathematical terms, saying that C dot is proportional to V. So when vigour is high, implying that stress is high, the amount of civilization tends to increase. Stress imposes authority on people, makes them more self-disciplined. So high V, C will be increasing. And then the rate of change of vigour is proportional to minus C, because when C is high, when people are obedient and orderly, then there's less stress, so V tends to fall. So it's a negative there. And we know that we can then combine these to get something like C double dot is proportional to minus C, which is then the equation of a simple harmonic oscillator. So C against time would go up and down like that. But if we plot C against V, we get this circle, the phase plot. And for Western civilization, Penman suggests that it was around here in about 1100 AD. So civilization was relatively low in Europe at that point, and stress, though, was tending to increase, and it moved towards this point, which he says Europe reached in about 1550. So civilization is starting to increase here, the level of civilization. People are becoming more civilized, and he suggests that Europe reached this point in around 1850. And we're now moving down here. So civilization was at its peak in 1850, and we're now moving down here. So we live in fairly comfortable, easygoing societies, and we're becoming less civilized. The decadence is increasing. Orderliness in society is decreasing. Hard work is decreasing. We're coming down to here on the civilization cycle. And you can see as well that the sort of timescales then we're talking about 1,000 years or so, which is like most other civilization theorists, Toynbee, Spengler, they saw these cycles of the rise and fall of civilization as lasting about a millennium or so. Now, they saw it as a one-shot, but in Penman's civilization cycle here, it looks like it will keep going round forever, but we will see that in fact it doesn't, because of the rise in that S factor which I mentioned earlier, which is this genetic change leading people to become less creative over time. So we'll have a look at that in a moment, but we'll also talk about another cycle that Penman identifies, which is equivalent to the lemming cycle in human populations. So it is an intergenerational cycle in that kind of adventurousness, creativity, innovation, exploration. Let's have a look at that. Okay, so this is Penman's theory of the G cycle, which corresponds to the lemming cycle. So it's of the order of 10 generations, and that's of the order of 300 years in human terms. And so we've got our generations marked around the cycle. So if this is generation G, then this is G plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4, plus 5, but it's also minus 5. This is minus 4, minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, and back to G. So G, as the physiological variable, G stood for growth. But when we talk about the G cycle, G also seems to stand for generation here in this cycle, in this representation of the cycle. So we can think of G as standing for either of those. And the peak of the cycle then is here when there's peak population growth and peak patriotism, loyalty to your society, and peak economic growth as well. So and also there's a high birth rate here and a low death rate. So this is a rapidly improving society. It's able to support a growing population and growing economic well-being. And there's a high level of patriotism. People are loyal to the members of their social group. And then when we move on to one generation, this is where V, for vigour, is at its peak. So here it's vigorous, but it's reaching its peak here. So this is the peak of confidence, peak aggressiveness, peak expansiveness. And in a society that's at this point in its cycle, we will see it indulging in aggressive warfare against other groups. And there it will also be a source of migration. Its members will be, vigorously spreading out and exploring the world. Then moving on a generation, this is the peak of child V. So here it's peak V because stress is high, and these people were children at this point. So they have the peak of child V. And so they show those features that we saw Penman attributes to child V. So they are prepared to live in large political units. They have weak local loyalties. They're not parochial. They're prepared to live in these large empires. They'll accept powerful rulers. They also have traditional attitudes. We saw traditionalism. So one consequence of that is that education tends to be focused towards the humanities. The humanities teach children about their own culture and their own way of life, and also the heritage of the society from its forebears. That's the humanities. And we'll see autocracy here because they're prepared to accept powerful rulers. Then moving on a generation still, G+3, there's still this traditionalism. It manifests, according to Penman, in orthodoxy, in religion and other forms of thought. Science is also at its peak here, which we might think is a bit strange if there's supposedly here orthodoxy, traditionalism, implying resistance to new ideas. Science would seem to be generating new ideas, but it's the kind of science that would is what Thomas Kuhn, the sociologist of science, called normal science. It's science within the paradigm, filling in details rather than revolutionary science. But so science, that kind of normal science, is advancing. G plus 4, he doesn't particularly associate anything with that. But G plus or minus 5 is the opposite then point to here. So whereas this had a high birth rate and a low death rate, resulting in large population growth, this has the opposite: low birth rate and high death rate. So population is growing very slowly here, may even be falling. And also is associated with low disease resistance. So this at this point in the cycle is when societies experience pandemics and plagues. Moving on to the next generation, G minus 4. This is the peak of C and the low of V. So peak of civilization type attitudes and low vigour. So that was the peak of V. We're now at the opposite point of the cycle. So there's a focus on economic skills, on economic growth, whereas these are involved in aggressive warfare. These are this society at this point of the cycle is least warlike. There's late parenthood. We saw there's low birth rate, still late parenthood, and few children, and the population is in decline or at least only stagnant. And then moving on to the next generation. So here is that was the peak of child V. This is the peak of infant C. So this is peak C. So the people who were babies in this generation experienced those C-type values of authoritarian control and inculcating values of self-discipline. So these are the most self-disciplined. They have peak infant C. They have low child V, so they're not particularly inclined. In fact, they're the opposite. Whereas the child V ones are inclined to live in large political units, these are the opposite. Their loyalties are to the local rather than to big political structures, and they have intense loyalty to local leaders. So it's their strong preference for leaders who are similar to themselves in culture and language, Penman says. They're less obedient to distant authority. And the local aristocrats are powerful. So people follow their local aristocrats, not the distant leaders who have or exert only weak control over the distant provinces. Also, these with their infant C, you may recall, it's associated with creativity. So they're open to change. And autocracy is weak. I've got here, which is what we've been discussing. They're resistant to these large, powerful, overarching political structures. And education, whereas here it tend to be focused on the humanities, at the opposite point of the cycle, education tends to emphasize technical education. So things that support economic growth and innovation, rather than with humanities preserving one's heritage. And so this is the kind of point at which we would expect nationalism and ethno-nationalism to be at its peak. Here people are more cosmopolitan, prepared to live in larger empires. Here they focus very much on their own nation, their own people, and resist incorporation into these larger political structures. Then moving on a generation again, here it's particularly characterized by religious independence and unorthodoxy. So it's part of this localism here as persisting into this next generation. This localism exhibits itself in religion. People develop local sects and don't belong to the overarching huge churches or recognize its authority. So this allows for renaissance in learning. The power of religion is weakened, becomes more local. So renaissance, enlightenment, new ideas come in at this point of the cycle. And then again, for this generation, it hasn't got any particular features to mention. And then we're back to the beginning of the cycle. So looking at going around the whole cycle, on this side, the people are, or the society is bold and tending to migrate, move outwards, go and conquer other people, migrate around the world. And then here they become more timid, more territorial. But they're also developing those creative, innovative habits that then can lead once again into high population growth and economic growth, which the population growth creates this stress that then produces the vigour that takes them around on the other side of the cycle. Now, one sort of somewhat contradictory thing, though, about this theory and this whole model is we saw that we had a cycle in V and C. Going around like that. So that when V is at its peak, C is at its peak a quarter of a cycle later. From peak V to peak C is just a quarter of a cycle. Whereas here, from peak V to peak C is half of this G cycle. Now this VC cycle here, this civilization cycle, takes hundreds of years. This cycle lasts just, this can take 1,000 years, or more than 1,000 years. So this is measured in the thousands. This is measured in 300 years. So within this civilization cycle, there will be multiple G cycles. It's not clear quite why in the civilization cycle, the longer cycle, there's only a quarter cycle difference between peak V and peak C, whereas here it's half a cycle. But that's what Penman finds it to be. But it's not a sort of direct contradiction because these are two different cycles. But what it does mean is that how long this cycle lasts depends on where you are in this cycle. So I've put here that the cycle is shorter in a rising civilization and longer during times of disorder. So because it depends on the level of V. If you've got a rising civilization with low V, then here V can rise to this point and fall back quite quickly. But if you're in a civilization up here in a time of disorder with a high level of V, then V can rise to its peak, but it falls back slowly because V actually has a tendency to be high anyway, because you're at this point in the civilizational cycle, you're in a period of disorder within your civilization. So it's difficult for stress and V to fall. And so the fall back to here takes longer. So this part of the cycle is of variable duration, depending on where you are in the VC cycle. So it's not necessarily exactly 10 generations. It could take more generations to fall back here and to complete the cycle. So there's an interaction between the two. Okay, now we'll consider Penman's ideas about stability, the S factor, the S variable. We saw that this arises from long experience of civilization. that produces a rise in this S factor. This, and remember, it's a genetic change. So it's kind of permanent. It's in people's genes. So what it means then is that people have had long experiences of self-discipline, self-control in societies with a high level of effective authority. So they've been selected for the kind of people who are happy with that situation, happy to, naturally self-disciplined. Those people will thrive in those kinds of societies. So there is this genetic change biasing the population towards the civilized kinds of attitudes. So it means that the population has a bias towards high C, and they can, therefore, they don't need to discipline their children to make them, obedient and self-disciplined, because they're genetically predisposed to that. So there's less need for, let's put that, it's high C despite low child C. So you don't need to train your children to have self-control. They're just naturally disposed towards it. So you can have, what this means is we've got a disciplined and orderly society and relaxed child rearing practices. So, is Penman thinking really of Western society here, that Western people are relatively disciplined and orderly by instinct, and they don't, discipline their children extremely harshly. They don't need to. The children are treated in a, relatively relaxed way. So there's a low child C, but you still retain in the overall society a high level of C. So what this means then is that these populations are compliant, because that's a feature of C. They are peaceful. So that's another way of saying the same thing. But they're compliant with authority. Their societies in general are peaceful. They're not, attacking their neighbours. And they are, though, because of this low child C, they are uncreative, which we saw earlier is a feature of child C. Child C makes people more creative. So because there's low child C, then people are less creative. So these are societies that are compliant and peaceful, but uncreative. So they're not changing, they're not going anywhere. And this then damps out the civilizational cycle. The C to V cycle, the cycle in the levels of C and V in civilizational and vigorous attitudes, because there's a lack of stress. Children are not subjected to stress, so they don't develop V for vigour. And so according to Penman, places like the Middle East and the Far East, they're like this. They've got long experience of civilization in those regions and high values of S, and so they are civilizations like this, compliant and uncreative. Whereas Europe, and at least we'd be saying this was the case. They were compliant and peaceful and uncreative. Whether that's true now is somewhat questionable. But for Penman, this is what he argues. Europe, Northwest Europe was a barbarian society until quite recently. It only became civilized in the last couple of millennia. So it had low S, but it's now coming to the end of a civilizational cycle. And that means its S factor is rising. So Europe is becoming more like these societies, compliant and uncreative. So Europe has been vigorous and creative, but it is losing all that. And because S is a permanent change, it's a genetic change, then although Europe may go through another civilizational cycle, it won't be as creative, innovative, exploratory and effective as it was in the last civilizational cycle. So the question is, where will the next brilliant civilization come from? It will come from a low S area, a region of the Earth that has not experienced a civilizational cycle. Well, Penman says there isn't one. Well, let's put there is no low S region. So he would see the societies, let's say, of Africa or the Pacific, which have not in recent times had advanced civilizations, as the residue of very ancient civilizations and have low S. So they're not necessarily civilizations in the sense of great cities, but they have had orderly and self-disciplined societies, and that these are now high S, high stability. They're unchanging societies, and this is why Penman would say, in Africa, you have not seen change in recent centuries, much change, apart from what was imported from outside. So if Penman's view is correct, it means that the world as a whole is coming to the end of its creativity and capacity for innovation. That it's really the end of human development, if you like, of all. There are going to be no more effective civilizations. The whole world is moving towards a condition of conservative, stable and authoritarian societies. That's what we should expect from this stability. Stability, meaning stagnation, and just doing the same thing over and over for forevermore. Uncreative, no change, but compliant and relatively peaceful. Okay, and now we'll consider Penman's thoughts on war. Now, we might think that wars break out for particular reasons. They might be fought over oil, for example, or over whether Germany should have invaded the Sudetenland, or whether the King of England has the right to tax the American colonists, things like this. So wars are fought over issues. But Penman says those are really just the excuses for war. And what really drives war is his hormonal, physiological variables. So he says that war is a physiological thing, and it's all about mood, the mood of a society, particularly the mood of young males. And so war tends to be at its height at times of peak V for vigour, which we saw is associated with aggression and outward tendencies. So that which in his generational cycle is at G+1. So that is when war will occur. It's a physiological matter. It's going to be cyclical, occurring at this particular point in our 10-generation cycle. He also says that because war is stressful, stress produces V. So those people who've grown up in a war will tend to have high V because they've been exposed to the stress of growing up in a war. They have high V, and that high V makes them more likely to produce war again. So he says that war has an echo. So then, the next a generation later, war is likely to recur again. So echo. So that war, stress, so childhood stress, we could say childhood stress to V, which leads to war. And so that's one generation on. Those who were children in the war, as adults, young adults, have high V and so tend to be more likely to fall into war again. And he gives then an example that you've got the 1914-18 war leading to the 1939 to 45 war, and then he says, although it wasn't a war, it was certainly aggressive behaviour in 1968, the student riots in France and elsewhere around the world. So this was conflict, another generation, 30 years roughly, conflict, another 30 years, again conflict. Each time that started to die out. So there's this echo. Okay, so what are we to make of Penman's ideas? As we can see, there's some sort of interesting concepts there. The kinds of issues he's considering seem to overlap with the things that theoretical historians are looking at. His G cycle is very similar in duration and character to the structural demographic theory of other theoretical historians. But that one trips over this idea that it's all to do with hormones and genes and physiology. The sociologist Emil Durkheim said that when a sociological fact is explained in terms of a psychological fact, we should know that explanation is wrong. Sociological phenomena should be explained by sociological phenomena. And I think that's what the same criticism that people might direct at this, that sociological things have sociological causes. Political phenomena are caused by political processes, not by bodily hormonal processes. Economic processes of booms and busts are due to properties of economic networks, not due to bodily properties of people. Now, that's kind of an article of faith, but we could say that, you see, the thing is that, yes, the lemmings have this generational cycle, but human society is far more complex than lemming society. So it's possible that those kinds of hormonal changes that we see in something like lemmings do operate in human society, but they're not going to be the whole story, because there's a lot more going on in human society than is going on in lemming society. So, it is another thing that we can put in our back pocket. We understand some of these ideas, and we can be aware of them, but we don't necessarily believe them or want to pursue them. But on the other hand, some people may find this compelling. And as I said, if you go on Penman's Biohistory website, you can find software and even offer a financial reward for doing some work within this framework.